The brand was a starburst of scarred tissue on the inside of her wrist, a permanent declaration of her worthlessness. Delphine traced its raised edges with the thumb of her other hand, a nervous habit she'd never managed to break. It was ugly. A puckered, silvered map of her family's shame, a mark that declared her the daughter of a traitor. In the scattered, wind-whipped islands of the Skullgrim archipelago, that was a sentence worse than death. It was a sentence of invisibility. She was a ghost who scrubbed floors and gutted fish, a whisper that other villagers spoke of but never to. Cold was her constant companion, the biting sea wind that sliced through her threadbare tunic, the icy slush of fish guts on the docks, the chill of loneliness that settled deep in her bones each night. She had forgotten what true warmth felt like. Her only solace was sound. Not the harsh cries of gulls or the endless roar of the surf, but the melodies she made herself. She hummed, low, quiet tunes that seemed to rise from a place deeper than memory. They were her shield, a fragile wall of sound she built around herself to keep the crushing silence at bay. They didn't fill her belly or mend her clothes, but they kept her soul from fraying completely. She was mending nets on the shingle beach, her fingers raw and numb when the sky turned the color of a bruise. The sea, usually a restless gray, churned into a black, frothing monster. A storm had blown in from the north with unnatural speed, a screaming phantom of wind and rain. It wasn't a normal squall, it was a hungry thing. Through the blinding sheets of water, she saw it. A ship, its sails shredded, its mast splintered like a broken bone. It was a royal vessel, its dark wood and silver inlay unmistakable even in the gloom. It fought the waves, a noble beast in its death throes, before the sea had its way. With a groan that vibrated through the very stones of the beach, the ship was thrown against the hidden reefs. The villagers ran not to help, but to scavenge. Delphine stayed where she was, frozen, watching the wreckage wash ashore. But then she heard it. Over the howl of the wind, a different cry. Thin, terrified, and utterly desperate. A baby. She moved without thinking, scrambling over slick, weed-covered rocks towards the sound. She found him in the arms of a guard whose face was a mask of blood. The man was dying, but his grip on the oilskin-wrapped bundle was absolute. He looked at Delphine, his eyes pleading. "The prince!" he rasped, his voice a wet rattle. "Save the prince!" Then his eyes glazed over, and his arms went slack. Delphine caught the bundle before it could fall. Inside, a tiny infant, no more than a few months old, screamed with the full force of his terrified lungs. His face was purple, his tiny body trembling. Other survivors were staggering from the surf. Guards in the king's livery, a lady-in-waiting with a gaping wound on her head. One of them, a woman with the severe face of a royal nurse, tried to take the child. "Give him to me!" she shrieked, her voice frayed with panic. But the moment her hands touched the baby, his screams intensified, becoming a piercing shriek that was almost unbearable. He thrashed, his tiny fists flailing. The nurse recoiled as if burned. Two more tried, with the same result. The child would not be touched. His wails were raw, primal, a sound of pure agony that clawed at everyone's nerves. Delphine, holding the frantic infant, felt a desperate instinct take over. She pulled the oilskin tighter around him, shielding his face from the wind, and began to hum. It was one of her quiet, secret melodies, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to settle the air around them. The change was instantaneous. The baby's frantic screams subsided into shuddering sobs. He turned his head, his wide, terrified eyes, the color of a stormy sea, finding hers. He hiccuped, a final, shuddering breath, and then fell utterly silent, his tiny hand reaching out to clutch the rough fabric of her sleeve. He was still trembling, but he was quiet. He was watching her. The surviving guards and the nurse stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. They looked from the peaceful prince to the brand on Delphine's wrist, visible where her sleeve had been pushed back. They saw not a savior, but a branded criminal holding the sole heir to the throne. They didn't have time to act on their suspicion. A second ship, larger and more menacing, appeared through the receding storm. The Alpha King's personal flagship. It anchored in the bay, and a longboat was lowered with grim efficiency. King Torin moved like the storm that had just passed. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and radiating an aura of cold, absolute power. His face was carved from granite, all harsh lines and stark plains, and his eyes were the color of winter frost. Grief and fury rolled off him in palpable waves. He was not looking for survivors. He was looking for what was his. His gaze swept over the wreckage, the bodies, the huddle of his people, and then it landed on Delphine. It wasn't her he saw, not at first. It was the bundle in her arms. He strode towards her, his heavy boots crunching on the wet gravel, each step a judgment. "My son," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, a low rumble of thunder that vibrated in her chest. The surviving nursemaid scurried forward. "Your Majesty, we don't know who she is. She just took him." The prince was distressed. Torin didn't look at the nurse. His pale, cold eyes were fixed on Delphine, and they narrowed as they caught sight of the starburst scar on her wrist. A flicker of something, disgust perhaps, crossed his face. He held out his arms. "Give him to me." Delphine's heart hammered against her ribs. She was holding the future of the kingdom, and its present king looked at her as if she were filth. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak, and tried to shift the baby into his father's arms. The moment she moved him, the prince let out a desolate wail. He woke from his dazed calm, and his face crumpled. He twisted his body, his tiny hand fisting in her tunic, refusing to let go. His cries grew louder, more frantic, echoing the piercing screams from before. Torin froze, his arms still outstretched. He looked from his son's anguished face to Delphine's. Confusion warred with impatience in his expression. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Nothing, Your Majesty," Delphine whispered, her voice trembling. "I just hummed." He stared at her, his disbelief plain. Hummed. "Try again," he commanded. With shaking hands, Delphine settled the baby back against her shoulder and began the low, resonant hum once more. The effect was just as immediate. The prince's cries choked off. He snuggled against her neck, his breathing evening out, his eyes fluttering shut. He was asleep in seconds. Silence fell on the beach, broken only by the sea and the wind. King Torin stood before her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully in the arms of a branded outcast, and then back at her. For the first time, she saw something other than cold rage in his eyes, a flicker of profound, bone-deep weariness, a hint of desperation. He had no choice. His heir, the only thing left of his late queen, would accept comfort from no one but this strange, scarred woman. "You will come with us," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "You are the prince's nursemaid now." He turned and stalked back towards his longboat without a backward glance, leaving Delphine standing on the beach, the weight of the sleeping prince in her arms feeling heavier than the entire world. The journey to the capital island, Skullgrim, was made in tense silence. Delphine was given a small, windowless cabin and treated like a necessary, but deeply unpleasant, piece of cargo. The royal guards watched her with suspicion, their hands never far from their swords. The court ladies who had survived the wreck whispered behind their hands whenever she passed, their eyes flicking to her wrist and then away, as if the sight of her brand might infect them. Prince Hadrian, however, seemed to believe she was the center of the universe. He refused to be held by anyone else for more than a few moments. He would not eat unless Delphine was the one to hold the spoon, her low hum a constant soothing undertone to the meal. He would not sleep unless he was in her arms, his tiny body curled against hers. She was his anchor in a world that had been turned upside down, and she, who had never been needed by anyone, found a strange, fierce protectiveness blooming in her chest. This tiny, fragile creature depended on her completely. It was a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. King Torin remained a distant, forbidding presence. He was a phantom of grief and authority, seen only in passing on the deck, his gaze always fixed on the horizon. He never spoke to her, never acknowledged her beyond the initial command. She was a tool he was forced to use, nothing more. She understood. How could he look at her, with the mark of a traitor on her skin, and feel anything but contempt? He was the king. She was less than nothing. The royal citadel on Skullgrim was a fortress of black volcanic rock that clawed at the sky. It was a place of cold grandeur, of echoing halls and tapestries that depicted brutal, bloody histories. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Delphine was installed in the royal nursery, a suite of rooms that were larger than any house she had ever been in, filled with soft furs and intricately carved wooden toys. It was a gilded cage. She was given simple, clean clothes of gray wool, a uniform that marked her as a servant. But no one told her what to do, beyond the obvious task of caring for Hadrian. The official nursemaids, women of minor noble birth, stood by uselessly, their faces tight with resentment. They were the ones who should have been tending the prince, but he would scream the moment they came near. So they watched Delphine with sharp, critical eyes, waiting for her to make a mistake. The king's visits were brief and painful. He would appear at the nursery door once a day, usually in the evening, his massive frame seeming to suck all the warmth from the room. He never stepped far inside. He would just stand there, his face a mask of stone, and watch his son. He would look at Hadrian sleeping in Delphine's arms, and a flicker of raw, unguarded pain would cross his face before being ruthlessly suppressed. He never looked at her. It was as if she were a piece of furniture, the chair his son happened to be sitting on. The coldness of his indifference was a familiar ache, a feeling she had lived with her entire life. She was used to being invisible. But with him, it hurt more. She would see the love for his son warring with the grief for his wife, and a part of her, a foolish, treacherous part, yearned for him to see her too. Just once. One night, Hadrian was restless. A fever had taken hold, and he tossed and turned in his grand cradle, his skin hot to the touch, his breaths coming in short, pained whimpers. The royal physicians had come and gone, muttering about sea dampness in the lungs and prescribing foul-smelling herbal poultices that did nothing. Delphine sat by his side all night, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth and humming endlessly. The melodies were deeper now, more complex, rising from that unknown well inside her. They seemed to ease his suffering, but they couldn't break the fever. Just before dawn, the door creaked open. It was Torin. He looked haggard, his face pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight. He had clearly not slept. He walked silently to the cradle and looked down at his son. The anguish on his face was so naked, so profound, it stole Delphine's breath. "He is all I have left of her," he said, his voice a raw whisper. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the beach. Delphine didn't know what to say. The words of comfort she might offer a village fisherman seemed hollow and absurd in the face of a king's grief. So she said the only thing that felt true. "He is strong, Your Majesty, like his father." Torin's head snapped up. His frosty eyes met hers, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. He seemed surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to speak. let alone say something that wasn't laced with fear or flattery. "You do not fear me," he stated, his voice full of a strange curiosity. "Everyone else does." "Fear is a luxury," Delphine replied quietly, her gaze dropping back to the sick child. "When you have nothing to lose. I only fear for him." He was silent for a long moment, studying her face. The silence stretched, filled only by Hadrian's labored breathing and her soft, continuous hum. "What is that melody?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I have never heard it before." "I don't know," she confessed. "They just come to me." He reached a hand into the cradle, his large, calloused fingers gently stroking his son's flushed cheek. A wave of cold seemed to emanate from his skin. Not the cold of the room, but a deeper, more intrinsic chill. Where he touched Hadrian, the baby shivered, his whimpers growing louder. Torrin snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, a look of self-loathing twisting his features. He clenched his fist, and Delphine saw a fine layer of frost glitter on his knuckles for a split second before it vanished. He was broken. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. This powerful, terrifying king was just as broken as she was. His damage wasn't a scar on his skin, but a coldness that lived inside him. A chill so deep it hurt the ones he tried to touch. It was the beginning of a fragile, unspoken truce. He started spending more time in the nursery, sitting in a chair in the corner, watching her care for his son. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, silent weight. They were two solitary islands, orbiting the small, vulnerable world of the infant prince. Then, the shadows started. Little things, at first. A sudden cold draft in a sealed room. A toy falling from a shelf for no reason. Hadrian waking from a dead sleep, screaming at something in the corner that wasn't there. Delphine felt a constant sense of being watched. A prickling on the back of her neck that made her shiver. She tried to tell one of the other nursemaids, but the woman just sniffed disdainfully and muttered about drafts in the old castle. One evening, she was rocking Hadrian to sleep, her hum filling the quiet room. Torrin was in his usual chair, ostensibly reading a ledger, but she knew he was watching. A gust of wind, impossibly cold and smelling of grave dirt, swept through the room, extinguishing half the candles. Hadrian let out a terrified scream and arched his back, his eyes wide with panic. In the same instant, Torrin was on his feet, a dagger appearing in his hand as if by magic. His eyes were not fixed on the window, but on the tapestry behind Delphine. "Get away from him!" he snarled, his voice a low, predatory growl. Delphine spun around. There was nothing there but the woven depiction of a long-dead king, but the air was thick with a malevolence that made her skin crawl. She clutched Hadrian tighter, her hum turning into a fierce, protective thrum. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart pounding. "Old magic," he said, his eyes scanning every shadow. "This castle has deep roots, and some of them are rotten." From that night on, their vigil became a shared one. He no longer sat in the corner. He stood guard. They were no longer just a king and a servant. They were two warriors protecting their charge. They would spend hours in the dim light of the nursery, not speaking, but bound by a common purpose. The trust between them wasn't spoken. It was forged in the shared silence, in the way he would move to stand between her and a darkened doorway, in the way she would meet his eyes across the cradle with a steady, unafraid gaze. His curse, the inner cold, seemed to worsen. She would see him wince, a hand pressing against his chest as if to contain an agony she couldn't imagine. He started wearing gloves, even indoors. He never, ever touched his son again. The distance was a torment for him. She could see it in the hollows under his eyes, in the tight set of his jaw. He began to talk to her. Not about feelings, but about history. He told her stories of the archipelago, of the old kings and the magic they wielded. He spoke of a witch, an ancient entity named Morwen, who had served the royal line for centuries as an advisor, her life unnaturally prolonged. He spoke of her with a respect that was tinged with something else: fear. "She was my father's most trusted counsel," he said one night, his voice low, "and his father's before him. She has guided this kingdom through 5 successions." "Do you trust her?" Delphine asked quietly. His gaze grew distant. "Trust is not a word I use lightly. She is necessary. Her knowledge is unparalleled." The next day, the advisor Morwen requested an audience in the nursery. She was a woman who seemed carved from petrified wood, ancient and unyielding. Her eyes were like chips of obsidian, and they held no warmth at all. She moved with a silent, gliding motion that was deeply unsettling. She smiled, a thin crack in her withered face. "The little prince is thriving, a testament to your unique care, girl." Her eyes flickered to Delphine's branded wrist. Hadrian, who was usually calm in Delphine's arms, began to fuss. He turned his face away from the old woman and buried it in Delphine's shoulder. Morwen's smile didn't waver. She turned to the king. "Your Majesty," the court whispers, "a branded woman in the royal nursery. It is unseemly. A danger. Her blood is tainted." "Her blood is of no consequence," Torin said, his voice like ice. "She is the only one my son will accept. That is all that matters." "But is it?" Morwen's voice was soft, silken, but laced with poison. "Or is there a darker reason for the child's attachment? An enchantment, perhaps? A magic of the blood that should have been scoured from these islands long ago?" Her words hung in the air, thick and venomous. She was planting a seed of doubt, not just for the court, but for Torin himself. Delphine felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This woman was the source of the shadows. This was the rot in the castle's roots. The confrontation Morwen had been engineering came during the winter solstice feast. The great hall was ablaze with light and sound, a forced merriment that did little to warm the castle's chill. Delphine was required to be present, standing in a shadowed alcove with Hadrian in her arms, should the prince become fussy. She was a ghost at the feast, invisible to the brightly dressed nobles who laughed and drank. But their eyes slid past her, noted her, and the whispers followed in her wake. The branded nursemaid, the traitor's whelp. A noblewoman, Lady Astrid, whose own daughter had been a candidate to be the royal nurse, approached them. Her face was flushed with wine and malice. "It's a disgrace," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The royal heir being raised by a common criminal. Who knows what filth she whispers in his ear?" Delphine ignored her, keeping her eyes on Hadrian, who was starting to stir uncomfortably from the noise. "They say her father sold secrets to our enemies," Astrid pressed on, stepping closer. "Treason is in her very blood. It's a stain. You should not be allowed to touch him." She reached out, her fingers like claws, to snatch Hadrian from Delphine's arms. "Give him to me. He deserves a caretaker of pure blood." A primal protective rage surged through Delphine, hot and fierce. It was a fire she hadn't known she possessed. All the years of humiliation, of being treated as less than human, coalesced with her fierce, desperate love for this child. Hadrian let out a frightened cry as Astrid's hand touched his blanket. "Be still," Delphine said. The words left her mouth, but they were not her own. Her voice was different. It was deeper, resonant, imbued with an ancient authority that had nothing to do with her. It was not a request. It was a command that echoed in the very bones of the hall. Lady Astrid froze. Her hand hovered inches from the baby, but she could not move. Her eyes were wide with shock and fear, her body rigid, a statue of malice. The nobles closest to them fell silent, their goblets halfway to their lips. The silence spread like a ripple through the great hall until the only sound was the crackling of the hearth. Everyone was staring. at the frozen noblewoman, at the bewildered baby, and at Delphine. Her power, raw and untamed, had erupted in front of the entire court. She felt it thrumming under her skin, a terrifying, exhilarating hum. She had done that, with just her voice. From the high table, Morwen rose to her feet, her face a mask of triumphant vindication. "You see? My king?" she cried, her voice ringing with false horror. "Dark magic. The taint in her blood reveals itself. She has ensorcelled the prince, and now she attacks your loyal subjects. She is a threat to us all." The court erupted in chaos. Shouts of "witch" and "traitor" filled the air. Guards started to move towards her, their faces grim. Delphine stood frozen, her heart hammering. She looked to Torin. He was on his feet, his face pale, his eyes fixed on her. But it wasn't anger she saw there. It was terror. As the chaos swirled around them, he took a staggering step forward, his hand flying to his chest. He gasped, a strangled sound of agony, and a web of black, icy veins spread from his neck, crawling up his skin. The curse. It was flaring, more violently than ever before. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. It wasn't just her magic that had been revealed. It was his feelings, the burgeoning warmth he felt for her. The protective bond they had forged over his son was being twisted into a poison inside him. Loving her was literally killing him. "The king is dying!" Morwen shrieked, pointing a withered finger at Delphine. "Her magic is killing him! Seize her!" Torin collapsed to one knee, his body rigid with pain, the frost spreading across his skin. He couldn't speak, couldn't defend her. He could only watch, his face a mask of torment, as his guards surged forward. They ripped Hadrian from her arms. The baby's screams tore through her, a physical pain worse than any blow. They grabbed her, their gauntlets cold and hard on her skin. She fought, but she was no match for them. The last thing she saw before they dragged her from the hall was Torin falling to the floor, consumed by a creeping frost, and Morwen gliding towards the screaming prince, a triumphant, predatory smile on her ancient face. The villain had won. The dungeon was a place beyond cold. It was a raw, damp chill that seeped into the stone and into her bones, a cold that promised decay. They had thrown her into the deepest cell, a place of absolute darkness and dripping water. The brand on her wrist throbbed with a dull phantom ache. They had won. Morwen had turned her own power against her, turned the king's heart against him, and stolen the only person in the world who had ever needed her. Grief was a hollow, aching thing in her chest. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, pulling her knees to her chin, trying to conserve a warmth that was already gone. But through her own despair, she could feel them. It was a faint, thrumming connection she hadn't known existed until it was threatened. She could feel Hadrian's terror, a distant, frantic pulse of fear and confusion. And she could feel Torin's life, a flickering, fading ember, being slowly smothered by an unnatural cold. Morwen wasn't just seizing power, she was feeding. Delphine understood it with a sudden, chilling clarity. The curse wasn't a property of the royal bloodline, it was a parasite. An ancient spell Morwen had woven around the throne centuries ago. It didn't feed on hate or fear. It fed on love. It took the most powerful, life-affirming emotion and twisted it, turning it into a poison that consumed the host from within. That's how Morwen had lived so long. She had been drinking the dying love of kings for generations. Torin's first queen hadn't died of a fever. She had been murdered by her own husband's love for her. And now, it was happening again. The thought of Torin dying in agony, his love for her becoming the weapon that killed him, was unbearable. The thought of Hadrian, alone and terrified in the clutches of that monster, broke something inside her. Rage, clean and pure, burned away the despair. Not the hot, explosive anger from the great hall, but a deep, cold, implacable fury. The fury of a mother whose child has been stolen. The fury of a woman watching the man she was beginning to love be destroyed. She would not let this happen. She refused. She sat up in the darkness. She wouldn't scream or fight. That was not the nature of her power. Her power was sound. It was resonance. She closed her eyes, shutting out the dripping dark, and focused. She reached for the small, secret well of melodies inside her, but this time she didn't draw out a lullaby. She drew out a single, perfect note. She began to hum. It started as a low thrum in her chest, the same sound she used to soothe Hadrian, but it grew. It was a note of pure intention, a sound that resonated with the very stone around her. It was a song of unmaking, of questioning the nature of things. It asked the iron of the bars, "Why are you strong?" It asked the mortar of the walls, "Why do you hold?" The stone of her cell began to vibrate. The iron door groaned, not from pressure, but from a deep internal dissonance. The fundamental structure of the metal was being sung apart. With a final screeching protest, the lock disintegrated into a fine gray powder. The heavy door swung inward. She stood up and walked out of the cell. The two guards in the corridor stared, their mouths agape, their swords half drawn. She looked at them, and the note in her throat deepened, became a chord of command. A sound that said, "You will not see me. You will not stop me." Their eyes unfocused. They looked straight through her, their expressions slack and empty, as she walked past them and up the winding stone stairs. She moved through the castle like a ghost, her voice her key and her cloak. She didn't know the way to the throne room, but she didn't need to. She could feel Torin, a beacon of fading light and agonizing cold. She followed the feeling, up through the silent kitchens and deserted halls, towards the heart of the citadel. The doors to the throne room were barred, but the ancient wood crumbled to dust at the touch of her song. She stepped inside. The scene was a tableau of horror. Torin lay on the dais before the throne, his body almost entirely encased in black ice. He was still breathing, but only just. A few feet away, Hadrian lay in a hastily erected cradle, his face pale, a faint wisp of energy being drawn from his sleeping form. And standing between them was Morwen. She held a black crystal in her hand, which pulsed with a sickening light, drawing the life force from both father and son. She looked younger, her wrinkles smoothed away, her eyes glowing with stolen vitality. She turned as Delphine entered, her face contorting in a snarl of disbelief. "Impossible. How did you escape?" "You fed on their love," Delphine said, her voice calm, but the air around her hummed with power. "But you forgot about mine." Morwen laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Your love. You are a branded stray, a nobody. Your affection is a pathetic, meaningless thing. It cannot stop me." "My father wasn't a traitor," Delphine stated, the truth of it settling into her with absolute certainty. "He knew what you were. He tried to expose you, and you had him branded and killed for it. The mark on my wrist wasn't a punishment. It was a seal, a binding you placed on my bloodline to suppress this power." She raised her hand, and the brand on her wrist began to glow with a soft golden light. It wasn't a starburst of shame. It was a sun. "You are a parasite, Morwen," Delphine said, her voice beginning to rise, to weave itself into a complex, powerful harmony. "And this bloodline is yours no longer." She began to sing. It was not a song of unmaking this time. It was a song of truth. A song of lineage, of the true history of the Skullgrim kings. A song of their strength, their love, their sacrifices. It was the song that lived in her blood, the ancient magic that Morwen had tried to silence. The witch shrieked, clutching her head as the song filled the room. The melody was anathema to her lies. Every note was a hammer blow against the foundations of her centuries-old deceit. The black crystal in her hand cracked. The siphoned energy flowing from Torin and Hadrian snapped back to them. The black ice on Torin's body began to shatter, falling away in tinkling shards. Color returned to Hadrian's cheeks. "No!" Morwen screamed, her form flickering. "I gave you power. I gave you long life." "You gave them a cage," Delphine sang, her voice soaring to a final, cleansing crescendo. "And now you will fade with it." The song of truth washed over the ancient witch. Her stolen youth evaporated. Her skin withered. Her hair turned to dust. Her form crumbling away until nothing was left but a pile of ancient robes and a shattered black crystal on the floor. The parasite was gone. The curse was broken. Silence descended on the throne room, a clean, peaceful silence. Delphine's song faded and she swayed, exhausted, the power receding, leaving a deep ache in its wake. A groan came from the dais. Torin was stirring. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his face etched with confusion and weakness, but he was alive. The black veins were gone. The unnatural frost had melted away. He looked at the pile of robes, then at his own hands, which were bare and warm. Then he looked at her. She stood there, trembling with the aftermath of the power she had unleashed, her simple gray dress seeming to glow in the dim light. The brand on her wrist was no longer a puckered scar, but a delicate, intricate pattern of shimmering gold, like a royal seal of her own. He got to his feet, unsteady but determined, and walked towards her. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, as if expecting the cold to return. Then, gently, he cupped her cheek. His hand was warm, so wonderfully, blessedly warm. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back streamed down her face. He wiped them away with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." "The curse," she started. "It was never ours," he finished, his frosty eyes now clear and bright, full of a dawning wonder. "It was hers, all this time." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw everything he had kept locked behind his mask of stone. The fear, the loneliness, the grief, and something new, something breathtaking. He took her other hand, his fingers lacing with hers, and gently touched the golden mark on her wrist. "This is no brand of a traitor," he said, his voice full of reverence. "It is the mark of a queen." From the cradle, a happy gurgle broke the silence. Hadrian was awake, his sea-storm eyes bright and alert, reaching his little hands out towards them. Torin smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his harsh face, making him look years younger. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, brutal winter. He scooped up his son with one arm, settling him on his hip, and then wrapped his other arm around Delphine, pulling her close. For the first time, father and son could touch without pain. For the first time, Delphine was held not as a servant, but as something precious. "I love you," Torin murmured into her hair, the words no longer a death sentence, but a promise. "And it's not going to kill me." She leaned into his warmth, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She was home. 6 months later, the world was reborn. Spring had come to the Skullgrim archipelago, not just in the pale green shoots pushing through the thawing earth, but in the heart of its people. The story of the branded nursemaid who became the singing queen was told in every village, a tale of impossible hope. Delphine stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, the sea breeze warm on her face. She was no longer dressed in servant's gray, but in deep ocean blue, the color of her new house. The golden seal on her wrist was a beautiful, intricate mark she no longer hid. It was a sign of her strength, her heritage. The castle was no longer a tomb. Laughter echoed in its halls. The dark tapestries had been replaced with bright, colorful weavings depicting not war, but peace and prosperity. Delphine had spent the months since Morwen's defeat not just learning to be a queen, but actively healing the kingdom. Her voice, once her private shield, was now her greatest tool. She could soothe diplomatic disputes with a carefully pitched word, encourage crops with a song of growing, and heal minor ailments with a hummed melody. The old magic, the true magic of their people, was returning through her. Behind her, the doors opened, and Torin walked out, carrying a now toddling Hadrian on his shoulders. The little prince shrieked with delight, his hands tangled in his father's dark hair. The king, who had once been a figure of ice and fear, was now a man defined by warmth and laughter. His love for his son and his new queen had thawed him completely. He came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He was a solid, comforting presence, her anchor in this new, unbelievable life. "What is my queen thinking about so seriously?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "that I've never felt the sun on my skin like this before. It feels different." "That's because you're not hiding in the shadows anymore," he said softly. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his gaze intense and full of a love that still made her breath catch. "You were never meant for the shadows, Delphine. You were always the sun." She smiled, a true, easy smile that reached her eyes. The self-doubt, the ingrained feeling of worthlessness she had carried for so long, was finally gone. It had been burned away by his love, by the truth of her own power. She knew her worth now. She had earned it. Hadrian leaned down from his perch and patted her cheek with a chubby hand, babbling happily. She reached up and squeezed his little leg, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love that was the bedrock of her world. This was her family. This was her home. A king who had been broken by a cold he couldn't control, a child who had been a beacon in the dark, and a woman who had been less than nothing. Together, they had healed each other. Together, they had found their song. As the sun began to set, casting long golden light across the water, Delphine began to hum. It was a simple, quiet lullaby, a melody of peace and contentment. Torin rested his chin on the top of her head, his arms holding her and their son securely. The three of them stood together, a portrait of a new world, watching the light fade, ready for the stars to appear. The long winter was over,